Good morning. I am Christina Felchlin, Director of Technology Consulting with Ledgeview Partners. I'd like to welcome you to today's Dynamics CRM 365 User Group webinar. For all of our customers joining us today, welcome back. For those who are not familiar with Ledgeview Partners, we are a Microsoft Gold partner and a business and technology consulting firm. We partner with organizations to transform sales, marketing, and customer service operations and processes that are supported by our core technologies, including CRM and marketing automation. To complement our technology solution, Ledgeview also provides strategic business advice and process definition consulting services that will help advance your business with a focus on sales, marketing, and customer service. We have a full agenda this month, but I'd like to start with a couple housekeeping items. To ensure the best audio quality for all attendees, we have everyone in listen-only mode. If you have a question, please ask it in the question pane of the webinar control menu. Just a reminder that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand at the end of this week. All registered attendees will receive an email with an access link to the recording, as well as the presentation slides. For today's agenda, our spotlight training topic is workflows. Michael has a lot of great tips and tricks, how to maintain your workflows, as well as how to troubleshoot and test your workflows. We've also included all of our best practices for those workflows. However, we won't have time to cover them all, but they will be included in the slide deck so you can have them at your fingertips when you need them. We will then close the webinar with user-submitted questions and our upcoming webinars. Now to get started with today's featured topic, I'll turn it over to our Dynamics 365 CRM expert, Michael Dodds, support consultant with Ledgeview Partners.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Christina. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're having a great February. For your monthly weather update, it is cold in Wisconsin, but apparently we're getting record highs out there in Boston. So back to you, Chip. Love is in the air for this February, so we're actually going to jump into one of my favorites. So my Valentine is workflows. So let's jump on in and get to the content. First, we're going to start off with workflow setup, tips and tricks. We're going to start off with scope, and actually with scope, this is one of the most important pieces that nobody really knows about. Scope is basically what records are going to be affected by the workflow. And as an important note, it is automatically, so defaulted to set to user whenever you set up a new workflow. And 99 times out of 100, you usually want to set the scope so to run it on all records in the entire organization. So it's a very important piece to set, because otherwise you'll start pulling out your hair, troubleshooting, trying to figure out what happened. So this is a very important piece to keep in mind. Now that we covered that, what does each scope item mean? So we have user, business unit, parent-child business unit, and organization. And if you've ever attended one of my admin trainings, or you've touched on security at all, you'll recognize these as the same items in security. User, this simply means that the workflow will only affect records that are owned by the owner of the workflow. So it's almost like an individual type workflow. Okay. Business unit, this is basically saying, hey, the workflow is going to affect all records in CRM for the entity that you're on for the workflow that are owned by people in the same business unit as the workflow owner. Okay. Now the second to last one, this is where it gets a little bit complex. It takes into effect parent and child business units. So let's say you have 6 business units, you have 5 child business units that look up to a single parent. Now, if the workflow owner is in that parent business unit, that means that any records owned by individuals in that parent business unit or the child business units, the workflow will affect those. And then organization, that's, as we kind of say for security, it's green wide open. It's going to affect all records in the CRM organization. So it may seem like just kind of a click and set the organization because that's the most common. But if you ever are wanting to set this, to only affect the, that business unit the workflow owner is in, or set it to more of an individual type to only affect your records as the owner of the workflow, there are options for you out there. So now that we set the scope, in other words, what records could this workflow affect? Next, we're going to go into, well, what triggers the workflow? What's causing my workflow to actually run? So those are triggers within the workflow, and there's a bunch of different triggers, but the most important one is also the one that gets confused the most, and that is record is created. In CRM world, when a record is created, that is literally every single action that is taken before you hit save for the very first time. So there are many times where users will set up a workflow, or admins will set up a workflow and think, okay, well, nobody's going to adjust or set this field until the record's already been created. Or they'll think about it from the standpoint of I only want to trigger when this field is changed. Well, what happens if the field is changed before the record is saved for the very first time? If you don't have a trigger as record is created, your workflow will not trigger. So very important. Now, the rest of these are all triggered after creation, okay? Record status change, that's simply what it means. You're changing the status of the record. So most commonly, like cases go to resolved, opportunities go to closed or lost, but it's also when you reopen an opportunity, when you take it from one to open, that's still a status change. Record is assigned when you change the ownership of a record. This also goes back to record is created. If you're creating a record for someone else, you're technically not doing the action of assign, you're just creating it for them. So keep that distinguished factor in mind. Record fields change. You can pick any field on the entity that the workflow is representing, and you can choose more than one. You can select multiple fields. And that states, so whenever one of those fields is changed, that's then triggering the workflow. Record is deleted, just like it sounds. When the record is deleted, triggers out this workflow. A really good use case here is if you want to be notified whenever a record is deleted in this entity, you could set a workflow to send you an email. And then also within a business process flow. This is a newer feature with Dynamics 365. The business process flow allows you to trigger off a workflow whenever you enter or exit a particular stage within the business process flow. However, that workflow must be on demand, okay? Speaking of on demand, that's one more trigger. This is a trigger, and it's a good idea to set it as on demand if you feel like it will ever need to be run as a one-off situation. So basically it's saying, hey, on demand process, I'm allowing to run this manually. I'm able to manually trigger this workflow. Usually done as a one-off, or another really common use case for this is if you have an option set and you're planning to remove one of the options, well, you're going to want to find all the records that utilize that option that you're removing, and you're going to want to change that. So you're going to want to go, all right, well, this option now needs to be changed to ABC instead of XYZ, okay? That's more of a manual process. There's no automatic trigger that's going to be doing this, but it's very important so you don't lose any data. Now, if you have thousands of records, it's very, very possible that there's multiple of thousands of records associated to that individual option that you're going to need to change. And if you've ever done anything with views, you know that you can only do things to 250 at a time at the most. So what can get really frustrating is if you hit the big check mark all 250, run the workflow on demand, and then it goes through, wait for it to go through, takes a little bit of time, click next, do the same thing over again. It can get tedious and take a long time. This is where an item called XRM Toolbox can come into play. It has a feature that's basically bulk workflow on demand. You run on-demand workflows in bulk. So you could run a workflow on thousands of records in a particular view, and it only takes about 2 minutes to set it up. But you want to make sure you have a view set and saved in advanced find that you can pull. You can also create a view with XML as well, but easiest to set it up in advanced find, set up a view, choose that view, choose the on-demand workflow, validate it, and then you'll choose your batch size. So I usually recommend 500. You can run up to 1,000 at a time. but that means it's going to run 500, stop for a second, and then run the next 500 until it's updated every record in that view. So instead of, possibly being sitting there for an hour, just clicking, you set it for about 2 to 3 minutes, of work, you're done. So it's a really, really helpful tool. Next, we're going to jump into background versus real-time workflows. So this is a common question that people will see, and it is, there's different schools of thought on which one is best. So I'm going to go into the differences of them and kind of where it's best to use these. There's a lot of really cool things that real-time workflows can do. One of them in particular is it can roll back all changes, if it fails. So if you have a workflow that's running, and let's say it's a 15-step workflow, you're doing 15 different actions, and you get through 14 of them and it fails on the last one, and that happens to be the most important one. Without it, everything else is kind of useless information. The real-time workflow will roll back all of those changes, essentially as if nothing happened. Where background, all those changes that were already made are still going to show. It's still as if they were done, and just won't complete the last one. Real-time workflows, this is the most prevalent, the one that everyone remembers. Real-time workflows, they run in real time. So essentially what that means is when you click save, it will then make that update to the form instantaneously. Where with a background workflow, it's running behind the scenes, you have to refresh your page in order to see that change happen. Now, with that, however, because it's running in real time, the users have to wait until that action completes before they can do any more work. Where background, once you trigger off the workflow, you can keep working. So there are times where you probably don't want your user to wait for something. One of those would probably be sending an email. You don't want to hold up your user from doing work while it goes through the process of sending out an email. Okay? So that would be one where you would most likely want to do a background workflow. There are other times where you would want to do a real time, but you don't want to necessarily have to hold up your user while you're sending out an email if it's not necessary. Okay? Along with that, you're going to have an error message. If with a real-time workflow, if there's an error occurs, because it's running real time and your user is held up and can't do anything until it completes, they're notified of the error right there. Where a background workflow doesn't notify you that it failed. It just sits in the background, logs it as failed, but doesn't actually pop up a notification to tell you. So that's a really important piece when, maintaining your workflows, and we're going to jump into an item here later that we give you some best practices on maintenance. Real-time workflows, this is the biggest drawback to real-time workflows. Your successful process sessions are automatically deleted, okay? And that can greatly affect troubleshooting, which we're going to touch on later. With background, you have the ability to set it so you can keep those process sessions, which aids in troubleshooting, okay? Real-time workflows, they require more system resources as opposed to background workflows. And also, real-time workflows can run as the user that triggers the workflow. They don't have to, but they have the ability to. So that means if I want to say, let's say Tyler makes an adjustment in a background workflow, like makes an adjustment that triggers a workflow. In audit logs, it's going to show that Tyler made the change, but then the system came in like a second later and did some changes. If you want to see the person that actually triggered off the workflow as the person that made the change, a real-time workflow can do that, where background cannot. However, in both, when you trigger an on-demand workflow, it runs as the user that triggered the on-demand workflow, which means it runs against that user's permissions. So if they don't have permissions, you're going to get a permissions error. Same as the real-time workflow that you trigger as the user. Keep permissions in mind. Okay. Next, we're going to jump into some use cases for real-time workflows. We kind of touched on it before. You need to see the change instantaneously on the form. You want to show an error message to your user. And then there's a really unique one that I'm actually a big fan of, preventing multiple triggers of the workflow from causing problems. And here's kind of an example of this. So if you are sending out an email message, let's say you want to set a condition where the opportunity is closing and it's closing less than a month from the time that the workflow triggers. But you also want to check if you've ever sent an email before on this, if you sent this email before. If you haven't sent the email before and the opportunity is closing in less than a month, go ahead and send the email. But then I want you to go into the opportunity and I want you to mark that we've sent the email. So basically setting a flag. And then say otherwise, if it's closing in over a month or we've already sent this email, just stop the workflow. Okay. The reason why I go into this detail is because with a real-time workflow, with a background workflow, you can have triggers that'll trigger this workflow multiple times. If that's the case, you've queued up a whole bunch of workflows, and one can start, and before it finishes, another one will start, which means you could send the same email 3 times because that flag wasn't set yet before the other one had already started running. Okay, so it's past the condition, it's moved on to sending the email. Okay. The other item is when you set it as real time, what it's going to do is the first one that's triggered is going to run all the way through. It has to complete all the way through, which means it's going to send the email, set the flag, and then it's going to trigger the next one, which means it will see, hey, this flag's already been run. It's going to go over here, say, yep, flag's already set to yes. I'm going to stop the workflow. Prevention of multiple workflows sending emails. Very important. Workflow setup. Very important to write out what you want your workflow to accomplish and all of the conditions for that workflow in which it needs to be run and which it shouldn't run. So when the logic should occur and when it shouldn't occur. Write everything out. It will help you find missing pieces, logic that you didn't think of, maybe a condition that you didn't consider. Writing it out is very important. Also, understanding existing workflows that are out there, business rules, JavaScript, any logic in the system that could have an effect on your workflow, meaning it could trigger your workflow. You could then trigger another workflow based on what you're setting. Very important to keep that information in mind. Utilizing conditions and conditional branches. Okay, conditions are saying if this occurs, then do this. Otherwise, if this occurs, do this different action. That's a condition in a conditional branch. Now, where I say even if there are no obvious conditions, what I mean by that is if you set a condition, if you set a workflow and you say, no matter what, I want this to run. But 5 months down the road, you make an adjustment to CRM and you say, well, now I only want to run this workflow if this field equals yes. Well, now you basically have to rewrite your workflow because you cannot just add in a condition and have the action associated to it. Because when you set a condition, it has if this, then. Okay, you can't just pull it in there. It's a drawback of the workflow. Okay, so if you set up something where you want it to always run, you just set up an if statement that simply says if the created on date contains data. Whenever a record's created, it's going to have a created on date, so it's always going to fire. But then if you need to make a change later on where you actually have a condition, you don't have to start from scratch. And then utilize dynamic fields when it's applicable. Dynamic fields allow you to pull data from other records. So like if you're on an opportunity, you can pull information from an account and dynamically set it based on the associated account information. Or for an email, you can dynamically send an email from the owner of the opportunity and dynamically set, the actual revenue, the date that it closed. So you can set up one email, but it will be different for each time it sends based on the record it's going off of. Very, very important. You could also do dynamic fields for conditions. For example, like lead notification. You probably don't want to send a lead a lead notification assignment email to the person that created the lead because they just created it. They know that they've been assigned it. So you could set it to say, if the owner does not equal the created by, then go ahead and send the email. Okay, so that's a dynamic field for a condition. We're not going to actually go through and do this demo just based on time, but I'm going to show you what it looks like. Our conditions are we want to do a background workflow for all opportunity records, trigger when the status changes, got to be able to run it on demand. Our conditions are the opportunity must be closed as one, the actual revenue is over 50,000. If the conditions are met, then we want to send an email. It needs to come from the opportunity record owner to their manager, so dynamically look to the user and then their manager field. Set the subject line to say an elite level opportunity has won by, and dynamically grab the owner of that opportunity, and then dynamically show the actual revenue, close date, associated account, created on date, and then a link to the opportunity. And it sounds really complex. It actually doesn't take too long to set up. So this is what the workflow looks like. Scope is organization. Status change, that's our trigger. We're running this also as an on-demand. We're going to keep our workflow process session, so we uncheck this box. Our conditions are if the opportunity status equals 1 and the actual revenue is greater than 50,000. Then what we want to do is create an email. So we do send the email. Very important. There's also a create email. That's just creating and then not sending it. If you actually want to send an email, click the send the email action. We're dynamically setting the from to the owner of the opportunity. Then what it's doing is it's looking into the owning user of the opportunity and looking at their manager, and that's who it's being sent to. Okay, there's our subject line. We're saying hello to our manager, so their name. Say this opportunity, we've linked the opportunity in for this account, it's been won. And then we're going to provide them with some key details, the actual revenue, the actual close date, the opportunity when it was created on. So basically, when was it created? When did it close? How long did it take? Okay. And here's just an example of that first part, not the actual email portion, to refer back to later. Next, we're going to jump into workflow maintenance. Workflow job retention, I showed you that checkbox, the automatically delete completed workflow jobs to save disk space. Uncheck that box. If you take anything from this webinar, uncheck that box. The reason why is because it's going to aid you in troubleshooting. Not always when a workflow doesn't run properly, is it because of a failure. It could have been run successfully based on the way it was set up, but it didn't do what you intended. So this helps you troubleshoot that. So it'll show you what stages of the workflow passed or was stopped at. It also helps determine if the conditions are set up accurately, because if it stops the conditions and you're thinking, wait, that should have gone through, and you realize, oh shoot, I said does not equal instead of equals. You just saved yourself a whole bunch of time instead of hunting through everything, troubleshooting for hours for something you could have just checked the condition for. Okay. Drawbacks, it uses up storage. However, if any of you have attended the admin trainings or attended the webinar back in October and November, top tips every admin should know, we talk about a bulk record deletion job that will clear up this information on a monthly basis. You get the benefits of being able to troubleshoot and keep those process sessions while also limiting your storage effect. Check for failed workflows. I mentioned that background workflows do not tell you that they failed. Okay, so once a month, you want to have somebody go in and check for failed and waiting workflows. Set up the filtering like this and set your columns here. This will help you in the information gathering based on the view. Save that view and review it once a month. You want to troubleshoot the error messages. If it's failed or waiting, you'll receive an error message. Not always with waiting. Sometimes with waiting, it's actually because of a wait condition. So if there's a wait condition, it could just be in the wait portion, and then it's okay. If it says waiting for resources, there's a couple of reasons why. There could be a large system job that's running during work hours that's bogging down the system, and it's just you're waiting in line. Okay. The other one, this could mean there's an issue with an async process that you'll need to troubleshoot. Some common maintenance errors, email notifications, anything to the to, from, CC, BCC, basically an email address. If the record you're looking at doesn't have an email address on the record, you're going to get an error message. you don't want to send emails to or from disabled users. There's also security concerns. If you didn't mark the ability to say, hey, if somebody wants to send an email on my behalf, that's okay. That's what a workflow is doing. The system is coming in and saying, hey, send this email as John Smith. Well, John Smith didn't allow me to do that. I'm going to fail. Okay? Read only and deleted records. Well, if it's running and then it's saying, hey, we didn't finish this because it's set to read only or it was deleted, well, what's causing the record to be changed before the workflow can edit it? Okay. Security errors. This is the real-time workflow when you're getting like an insufficient permissions error. You're going to want to troubleshoot. Why can't my user run this? Is there a security setting that I need to make? Or is this something where I need to change the workflow to run as the workflow owner instead? New customizations, that could have an effect on your workflow. If you made a new field required, if you ever go to edit that workflow for any reason, deactivate it, it's going to make you put something in that required field before you can resave it. And then if you have any condition based on disabled users, get them out of there because they're disabled. They no longer need to affect your workflows. Next, we're going to touch on some troubleshooting, some common errors. Infinite loop. Most common infinite loop out there is if you say, hey, my trigger is create a task. Well, then within that action, within the actual workflow, I say then create a task. Well, then you created a task. That's your trigger. You then create a task, which then triggers the workflow again. So you just get stuck in a loop. Some are obvious. If it's very obvious, the system's going to come out and tell you, hey, infinite loop, you can't do it. Other ones, not as obvious that the system doesn't catch right away, but will, when it starts to run, will be due to an infinite loop, will be an error message later. Not setting up the create as a trigger. So something didn't trigger, and that's because you didn't have create as a trigger. Okay. Try to add a condition to an action that is already on the workflow. Remember, if you're adding a condition later, you have to rewrite the action piece to be part of the condition. Related entities. You cannot pull information from the many side of an entity, meaning an account cannot go into contact and pull information. You can't use it as a condition. You cannot update the contact net. You cannot update your entity, your account entity, from information from the child record. Now, there's custom workflow activities that can allow you to do this, but out of the box, you cannot. Don't use a workflow for calculation. Utilize calculated fields. Any errors in your workflow, you're going to get a big red X. You got to resolve those before you can save it. Okay, that simply means that there's an incomplete step or a required field could be missing on the create action that you have, like where you're creating a record in your workflow. Your workflow can trigger other workflows unintentionally. If that's the case, then there's going to be some errors there, and when those shouldn't be triggered, you're going to need to readjust those. Timing issues. You can have two workflows running at the same time, and that could be simply a case of which one is going to win. Make changes to a record before the workflow finishes. You can only do that with background workflows. Testing, always test. Okay. Before rolling out before rolling anything out live, test every scenario and when it should and should not trigger the workflow. Test every condition. Make sure you're receiving the proper results. Test where the conditions aren't met. Every time you make even the smallest tweak, test it again. And then really important, designate a few power users to go in and test the workflow functionality, because users utilize the system differently than an admin might perceive, and they're going to uncover unique issues and errors. Okay. Definitely utilize your process sessions to help troubleshoot a workflow. You can access them from the workflow, from the system jobs, or from the actual record itself. The error will show up top, the process progress, basically where it got to, and then also the details will show you some additional information as well. If you don't have that process sessions box unchecked, you want to reproduce it after you uncheck that box. If there's an error, try and reproduce it. Make sure that you can reproduce it, because that could tell you some information within your troubleshooting. Consider business rules, JavaScript, plugins that could be affecting your workflow or causing other things to trigger that you didn't originally intend. And then utilize audit logs to understand what change was made that triggered my workflow. Okay, that will help you troubleshoot as well. Below are some best practices to keep in mind. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go through those, but I want to leave them on the PowerPoint so you can review at a later date. Next, we're going to jump into our one user submitted question. Our question is, how can I know which proposals are expected to be converted into sales in this quarter? This can be very unique depending on how you currently have your system set up. But what I would recommend just based off of this question is to set up a view that looks at open opportunities that are closing in this fiscal period. Now, that's provided you set up your fiscal periods to be set to quarters in the fiscal year settings of business management. Then set your columns to show the fields you would like. But I recommend at least having the following: the account associated to the opportunity, the contact, the estimated close date, the estimated revenue, and the owner. And then here's just a quick little view of how the filtering should be set up.
All right. Thank you, Michael, once again for preparing and sharing this workflow content with everyone today. Did you know that Microsoft has a new release out? Most existing orgs can schedule their upgrade for April. Ledgeview wants to make sure you know all the latest features and how to prepare for your upgrade. Please join us next week, Tuesday, February 27th, when our pre-sales engineer, Tom Lemron, fills us in with the latest Microsoft Dynamics 365 version 9 update. Then you can join us next month for our next Dynamics 365 user group, and the spotlight training topic is advanced finds. As always, if you're looking for great resources, please visit our website, ledgeviewpartners.com, and click on the resources page to view our blog, white papers, case studies, and past webinars. On behalf of Michael, myself, and all of us at Ledgeview, we thank you for taking the time to attend our user group webinar today. Have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.